For those of you that do not know me, my name is Doug Simon, and I am Emeritus Professor of Political Science from Drew University. It's a pleasure talking with you. I wish it were face-to-face, but unfortunately the pandemic doesn't really allow that. The subject of my talk today is the changing nature of war, and it is an enormous topic. Perhaps too large to do it justice in a single talk such as this. But it is a subject worthy of serious thought for no other reason than we are living in the midst of a global paradigm shift. A shift as powerful as the Agrarian Revolution, the advent of movable type, and the Industrial Revolution. It is, of course, what some people have termed the dawning of the digital age, or cyber world, whose impact, frankly, we are just beginning to understand and experience. And with each paradigm shift, there are profound impacts on the way we interact as human beings, cultural, economic, political, and most assuredly, the manner in which we violently confront each other. It is often said that nothing ages quite so quickly as yesterday's vision of tomorrow. Put simply, we have been wrong so many times in trying to predict the future, particularly the long-term future. So before we examine some of the ways warfare is changing and the forces causing those changes, a cautionary note. Whether civil war or interstate war, there does seem to be widespread agreement that the character of war is changing. Terms like hyperwar, hybrid war, nonlinear war, cyber war, fourth generation war, and asymmetric war litter the writings on the subject. But as noted by Zachary Tyson Brown of the Modern War Institute, quote, war has many faces, but its logic has been consistent since the dawn of time. Yes, its character is always adapting itself to the environment in which it is expressed. But when you strip away all its modern trappings, war is at its core organized violence waged for political purposes. With the surge of modern technology for decades, we have heard rumors of the demise of conventional or traditional warfare. For instance, for years, it was assumed that modern air power would overwhelm the foot soldier. This is something I repeatedly heard as a young air intelligence officer during my early months in Vietnam in 1965. The National Liberation Front of the Viet Cong had no air power, and really neither did the North Vietnamese, with no real ability during the early years of the war to effectively send interceptor aircraft or missiles against American fighter bombers striking in the north. Put simply, modern jet fighter bombers were going to be the difference maker in this war. Well, it did not take long for reality to set in. While North Vietnamese and Viet Cong ground forces operating in South Vietnam took enormous casualties, many through American air power, they nevertheless persevered. They were not overwhelmed, and they did not give up. And in North Vietnam, even before surface-to-air missiles were installed, North Vietnamese air defense consisted of massive numbers of anti-aircraft artillery pieces of World War II and Korean vintage, and they exacted a heavy and discouraging toll on modern American aircraft. And more recently, of course, we have that horrible 3-year period, 2004 to 2007, in Iraq, when America's modern war machine absorbed heavy losses due to the effective use of hundreds of IEDs, or improvised explosive devices. Many of these were used artillery shells loaded with explosives from shrapnel, attached to fairly simple detonating mechanisms and buried along roadsides, causing enormous damage to American convoys and inflicting death and horrible injuries on our troops. What is going on here? Well, General H.R. McMaster, the president's former national security advisor, wrote an interesting article back in 2008 in which he asserted that we have for far too long held the belief that technology could overcome anything, what McMaster calls capabilities-based thinking about future wars. Our defense planning for future conflict has been based on advancement in our technology rather than a well-thought-out analysis of real emerging threats. In other words, rather than planning for the future by developing faster, more accurate, and more complex weapon systems because we can, we should be concentrating on what is really happening on the ground, not in our laboratories. What are the cultural and historical forces, and in what parts of the world that are evolving and will constitute real threats that may have to be met? It is after we have done that kind of analysis, you can start talking about new weapon systems. For McMaster, our reaction to 9/11 was a classic example, specifically in Afghanistan. To put it in the simplest terms, our capabilities-based thinking led us to believe that our new and advanced surveillance and information technologies were going to allow us to dominate the battlefield because we had a better read on the topography of the land and where the enemy was located. That further led us to the belief that we needed fewer forces and could rely more on small, highly elite units, Rangers, Special Forces, Delta Forces, and SEALs. And what happened at Tora Bora? Well, our surveillance of difficult terrain could not compensate for the lack of ground forces to cover all the exfiltration routes. And after a 16-day battle, many of the al-Qaeda forces, including Osama bin Laden, escaped across the Pakistan border. All of this does not mean that the way we conduct war is not changing. But any assessment of change must be careful to get as firm a read as possible on future threats and to avoid exaggerated claims about new exotic weapon systems. With all of this in mind, I'm a bit reluctant to make specific predictions as to the nature of war in the future. What I can do is offer some thoughts on the frequency and intensity of war, where some of the battlefields might be, who will fight future wars, and what kinds of weapons might be employed. I think it might be appropriate to begin with some thoughts on the frequency and the intensity of armed conflict. You know, the end of the Cold War was supposed to bring a lessening of tensions and a decrease in armed conflict around the world. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the primary axis of conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States was gone. And with it, the Cold War battles involving either the Russians or the Americans intervening on one side or another, or through their proxies. In 2011, Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker wrote an extraordinary book, The Better Angels of Our Nature. No doubt some of you are familiar with it. Citing voluminous statistics, Pinker posited that as a species, human beings were becoming less violent. More relevant for our discussion today, we were witnessing a significant decrease in the frequency of war, both civil and interstate. Was or is this true? Did the end of the Cold War bring about a reduction in the frequency and intensity of war? Or was this a false dawn? Have we really become less violent? Are we fighting fewer wars? Are deaths attributable to armed combat really declining? Well, as with so many things, the answer to these and other similar questions are complicated. Certainly, as we survey the news about violent interstate war, civil war, and insurgency, we are struck by names like Afghanistan, Iraq, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Darfur, Libya, South Sudan, Yemen, Syria, Chechnya, Dagestan, and Nagorno-Karabakh, South Ossetia, Central African Republic, Myanmar, the Niger Delta, Baluchistan, Kurdistan, Paraguay, Chad, Somalia, Mali, Cameroon, Ivory Coast, and of course, the drug cartel wars of Mexico. These and other conflicts, all of them occurred after the collapse of the Soviet Union. In a recent article in the journal Foreign Affairs, Tanisha Fazal and Paul Post of the University of Chicago have noted that Pinker was not alone in his optimism and hopeful view that we are experiencing a lessening of violence. President George H.W. Bush and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher coined the term peace dividend, denoting a period of quiescence that would result from the end of the Cold War. But was this really an accurate depiction of the world? In his study, Pinker used a variety of statistics, but the core of his case was essentially based on two insights. First, fewer people die in battle today than in past, both in absolute terms and as a percentage of world population. Reviewing centuries of data on war fatalities, he argued that not only is war between states on the decline, so are civil wars, genocides, and terrorism. And he attributed this to the rise of democracy, increased trade, and growing belief that war was illegitimate. The second focus of Pinker's argument was that there had not been a world war since 1945. Unfortunately, I don't think it's all that simple. For instance, using a reduction in battle deaths as an indicator of a decline in armed conflict has some problems. Several prominent databases require that a war be defined by a minimum number of battle deaths. For instance, the most well-known and prestigious ongoing study, the Correlates of War Project, requires 1,000 battle deaths to be considered a war. But what happens when the number of battle deaths decline and fall below that threshold, but the number of wounded goes up? Do we still have a war? The reality is that since World War II, we have witnessed dramatic improvements in military medicine, lowering the risk of dying in battle. But that does not mean we are drastically reducing the intensity and frequency of armed combat. For hundreds of years, the ratio of wounded to those killed in battle held steady at roughly 3-to-1. Today, the US military wounded to kill ratio is almost 10-to-1. That is 10 soldiers wounded to 1 soldier killed, and many other nations have made similar strides. In addition to better combat medical practices, such as advances in combat surgery, use of antibiotics, and more rapid evacuation via helicopter from the battlefield, better sanitation has also been important. Deaths from disease have been drastically reduced. In wars like the Russo-Turkish War of the late 19th century, it was not uncommon for 80% of the deaths resulting from disease. The good news is that battle deaths were drastically reduced, particularly in the decade following the end of the Cold War. But that does not mean that wars are less violent or less frequent. In fact, a number of highly thought of studies indicate quite the opposite. The Uppsala Conflict Data Program indicates that the number of armed conflicts has been increasing in recent years. They do not use battle deaths as a means of defining a war, and by doing so, they do not eliminate conflicts from the war count just because battle deaths have declined. Their data suggests that, as we have already noted, wars have become less lethal, but the number of combatants and surviving horrific wounds has increased. In 2017, the United Nations University Center for Policy Research published a paper on the changing nature of armed conflict. Their data indicated the following. After declining for much of the 1990s, the decade immediately following the end of the Cold War, the number of major civil wars has almost tripled. Second, the recurrent rate of civil war occurring in the same region has increased due largely to weakness of the government institutions in those countries. The third finding of the UN study was that from 2011 to the present, that sadly there has been a six-fold increase in battle deaths, with 2014 and 2015 being the deadliest years on the battlefield since the end of the Cold War. The fourth finding was that conflicts are becoming more intractable and less conducive to traditional political settlements, mainly due to three developments. Organized crime in many countries undermines the government's legitimacy, lowering the incentives of armed groups to enter political settlement with those governments. There is just no guarantee that the weakened governments are capable of adhering to a peace settlement. Further, the internationalization of civil wars tends to make them deadlier and longer. The recent civil war in Syria is a case in point. No less than 8 countries and numerous outside groups, such as Lebanon's Hezbollah, Kurdistan, the Houthi movement, and the Islamic Front, and Ansar al-Islam, all were involved. Also, the growing presence of jihadist groups in conflict settings complicates the peacekeeping efforts. Jihadists tend to operate with a moral certainty of their cause, not terribly conducive to negotiations. And finally, in civil war situations, violence against civilian populations is increasing. This was certainly evident in the Balkan Wars of the mid-1990s in Bosnia-Herzegovina, as well as the recent Syrian civil war. So given all of this, it would not be unreasonable to assert that the patterns of war in the decades following the end of the Cold War may have been something of an anomaly. That as humans, we are just as likely to engage in vicious wars as we have ever been. Now, I must say I like Steven Pinker. In fact, I'm a big fan. I like his optimism and his attempt to put things in some historical perspective. But unfortunately, his assertions about the frequency and intensity of war need a second look. Well, not to end this part of the discussion in total despair, it is important to note that in recent decades, there has been a remarkable increase in the level of international security activism attempting to prevent conflicts from breaking out or to stop ongoing conflicts. This has included a threefold increase in the United Nations and non-UN peace operations. There are currently more than 30 such operations underway around the world, with a comparable number of non-UN missions in the field. There has been a significant increase in the UN Security Council Chapter 7 resolutions. Under the UN Charter, Chapter 7 resolutions authorize the Security Council to respond to threats to the peace with military force, sanctions, or other means. During the Cold War, Chapter 7 was almost never used, constantly being vetoed by the Russians in the Security Council. The end of the Cold War changed all of that. And finally, there's been a fivefold increase in the number of special representatives of the Secretary General of the UN sent into conflict areas trying to lower tensions. So the news is not all bad. There is international concern and action to try and prevent and or halt violent conflict that at any point in history, and that is certainly to the good. Now some comments on the motivation for war. Stanley Kobar, a research fellow at the Cato Institute, has posited that throughout history, wars have basically been of two types: wars of plunder and wars of ideology. Perhaps the best examples of wars of plunder are the wars of imperial expansion, in which the Europeans acquired colonies covering over half the world's known world. Wars of ideology are represented by great wars of religion, the Crusades, the 30 Years' War, the Ottoman Wars in Europe, the Israeli-Palestinian Arab Wars, Pakistan versus India War, just to name a few. Both World War II and the Cold War have been characterized as democracy versus fascism and democracy versus communism. Kober agrees that the two kinds of war frequently overlap, but that over time, and especially over the course of the past century, the focus of war has shifted from plunder to values or ideology. But there are some problems. Merely bifurcating our understanding of the motivation of war into two categories is just too simplistic, as is Kober's contention that they occasionally overlap. In my judgment, war is far more complicated than that. I would start out with the assertion that virtually all wars are multi-causal, with certainly more than one motivation and probably more than two. Granted, a war may be initiated for a single overriding reason, but will rapidly become a multi-causal enterprise with, among other things, differing motivations on different sides of the conflict. This may be particularly true when there are multiple protagonists. Wars can be fought for any combination of reasons. Religious beliefs, as we've already noted. Economic interests, not only to acquire, but perhaps to protect economic interests. Hubris, stirred by the feelings of omnipotence, nationalism, superiority. Wars may be initiated with the belief that we can change the world. For instance, it is now well documented that the neocon advisors in George Bush's administration firmly believed that taking out Saddam Hussein's regime, Iraq would welcome us with open arms and quickly establish a viable democracy, and this would be the first step in a democratic revolution that would transform the Middle East. Acquiring strategic advantages can be another motive. The Russian acquisition of Crimea region of Ukraine and the port of Sebastopol is clearly such a case. And looking to the future, I am convinced that we may well experience at least two kinds of war as a result of climate change. Resource wars, particularly over water, and wars waged against the movement of massive numbers of refugees fleeing regions of the world heavily impacted by climate change, most likely equatorial regions of the planet that have become unlivable because of excessive heat. Now, who fights wars? Prior to the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, wars were primarily fought by empires and dynasties of one sort or another. They were replaced by nation states, and in terms of interstate wars, countries were the principal protagonists. In the case of civil wars, most often, it has been a revolutionary group challenging a government. In the case of the American Civil War, it was a group of states challenging another group of states with the use of secession. But it was also a group of southern states challenging the federal government in Washington. And while there have always been violent non-governmental groups of one sort or another, pirates, revolutionaries, terrorists, mercenaries, and criminals, the past few decades have witnessed a massive increase in the number of non-state actors littering the battlefields of the world. From ISIS and Al-Qaeda in the Middle East, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, FARC in Colombia, the Lord's Resistance Army in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the Sinaloa cartel of Mexico, all have played critical roles in armed conflict around the world. The proliferation of these groups poses a number of problems in the present, and I suspect the future. The sheer number running into the thousands worldwide presents a daunting task for intelligence agencies. How do you marshal effective means of penetrating these groups, uncovering their intentions and plans? Second, these groups tend to blur the lines between civilians and combatants. And third, with modern technology, these groups have the ability to rapidly communicate with each other. If they so choose, they can coordinate their efforts with ease. And fourth, these groups call into question the concept of state borders, which is the core of the sovereign state system. A recent rather dramatic example of this was ISIS's attempt to establish a caliphate in northern Syria and Iraq. To be sure, states will monopolize the weapons of war and dominate the battlefield. But will these violent non-state actors pose a threat to the dominance in the future? An interesting question. Where will future wars be fought? Well, let's get one thing out of the way first. There is not much evidence that the traditional areas of battle will somehow disappear. There will still be ground battles in deserts, forests, and jungles. There will still be battles for air superiority, and there will still be naval engagements, although with new technology, there is increased vulnerability to the lumbering warships that ply the seas. But there are three areas that are worth considering in the future: a growing urban environment, near and outer space, and of course, cyber world. We live in an increasingly urbanized world, not only slums, but also wealthier sections of megacities, constituting battlefields that do not compare with the urban warfare, let us say, 200 years ago. The sheer size of today's cities is staggering, making effective governance difficult and providing operating space for a variety of conflicting actors in the midst of massive civilian populations. Think about these numbers. First, establish a familiar base for comparison. Say the population of New York City, with a little over 8.5 million people. Now we're talking New York City proper. Songjing, China, 30,484,000. Shanghai, 24,256,000. Beijing, 21,516,000. Karachi, 14,910,000. Tokyo, 14,831,000. Mumbai, 12,478,000. And Sao Paulo, Brazil, 12,250,000. That's against New York City's 8.5 million. And all of these are just the city limits. For some of these cities, one has to consider the population of entire metropolitan areas. And here the numbers are even more staggering. Mumbai, Dhaka, Laos, Nigeria, Jingzhou, China, Sao Paulo, and yes, New York City have metro area populations all in excess of 20 million people. How do you effectively engage large violent insurgency groups in environments such as these, with enormous civilian populations tightly packed together? A difficult problem, to be sure. Now, some people laugh at it, but the recent creation of an American Space Command as part of our defense establishment was probably a smart move. There are currently approximately 12,000 satellites of one sort or another in orbit around the Earth. Many are there for scientific study purposes. Many provide public services like open communications relay and weather imaging. And still others are classified and provide valuable military communications, command and control, and intelligence functions. There is little doubt in my mind that such a rich environment will make space a critical battlefield of the near future. Now, why do I say that? Well, one example. In recent decades, many militaries, particularly in the West, have become increasingly dependent on GPS, the global positioning system for navigation, positioning of precise munitions, and timing. That means adversaries like China and Russia are focusing considerable efforts on the ability to disrupt or destroy that system in time of war. And that, of course, brings us to the third battlefield, cyberspace. A great deal has been written about cyber espionage and cyber war, so I'm not going to dwell on this too long. Indeed, we just learned of the massive hacking of government organizations and private companies, almost assuredly carried out by the Russians. Some people have asserted that cyber warfare today challenges Clausewitz's notion of the centrality of violence to the nature of war, and that it is somehow supposedly nonviolent, a nonviolent form of conflict. In my judgment, that is a ridiculous assertion. While pushing the key that unleashes a particularly dangerous piece of malware, such as the Stuxnet virus used on Iran's nuclear program, may not be violent in and of itself, the result of employing that digital weapon can certainly be violent. Airplanes brought down due to the disabling of air traffic control systems, the flooding of towns and or cities when the controls on large dams are shut down. And remember that cyber warfare has the potential to disrupt and disable conventional military intelligence and weapon systems that are increasingly dependent on computer capabilities for their operation. The other area of concern here is, of course, in the realm of misinformation, specifically using the internet. In earlier times during wars, great efforts were made to demoralize both enemy troops and civilian populations. The use of propaganda became a weapon in the arsenal of war. But the dawning of the digital age has once again brought a quantum leap in what we might call information warfare. Here we are talking about, among other things, the spread of disinformation made easy by a wide variety of social media platforms and the ability to digitally alter texts and images and present them as truth. We, of course, only got a glimpse of this recently with the Russian cyber warriors creating false narratives in our social media during the last presidential campaign. That practice is only going to accelerate in the future and be difficult to manage. The cyber world we just discussed quite naturally brings us to my final topic, the future of the weapons of war. We've already begun to witness the widespread impact of computer technology on the modern battlefield. Night vision goggles for individual soldiers are almost standard equipment now. The use of individual voice communication capabilities between soldiers on the battlefield, computerized firing calculations for modern tanks and artillery, the employment of small and large drones either for intelligence gathering or the employment of missile systems, stealth aircraft and naval vessels, and the whole area of advanced electronic warfare. There's a whole array of weapon systems in various stages of development based on the latest digital technology. Many experts believe we are just scratching the surface of these applications. But recall my earlier comments with regard to capabilities-based planning. Is real threat driving the development of these weapons, or is it technology itself? I'm really not prepared to fully address that question. Hours could be devoted to the subject. Regardless, there are emerging weapon systems worth noting and thinking about. Let me focus on just two: hypersonic weapons and autonomous weapon systems. Since the end of World War II, we have witnessed the development and deployment of very accurate low-altitude cruise missiles and long-range strategic ballistic missiles, as well as standoff missiles fired by aircraft fairly long distances from their target. And now we are approaching the deployment of numerous guided hypersonic missiles. Hypersonic, defined as traveling at Mach 5 times the speed of sound or faster. In one sense, this is not entirely new. The German V-2 rocket of World War II and many of the current ballistic missiles approach hypersonic speeds. But early versions were not very accurate. But more important, they flew on fixed ballistic courses, making them easier to detect and perhaps intercept. Whether high-altitude hypersonic weapons, what are known as glide missiles, or low-altitude hypersonic cruise missiles. What is new is the capability for controlled flight at unbelievably high speeds, the ability to alter the direction of the missile as it travels to its destination and accurately strike its targets. What seems like erratic shifts in direction at high speed can make it extremely difficult to intercept. The other area of future weaponry that I would like to comment on is the introduction of AI, or artificial intelligence, in the development of autonomous weapons, something called LAW, lethal autonomous weapons. These are basically robots that can independently search out and engage targets based on how they are programmed. It is important to note that autonomous weapons are really not as new as you would think. For instance, landmines can be considered autonomous. Some of the current fast reaction defensive weapon systems are autonomous, such as the US Phalanx system that is designed to autonomously identify and attack incoming missiles, rockets, artillery, with the use of criteria set by a human operator. The Russians, Israelis, and Germans have similar systems. Some of you may have heard of the Israeli Iron Dome anti-missile system. But these are all defensive systems developed because of the need for incredibly fast defensive reactions. What is most troubling now is the development of autonomous offensive systems. These systems, generally known as LAWs, can be designed to operate in just about any environment: air, land, water, underwater, and in space. Perhaps the biggest issue in this whole area is just how autonomous these weapon systems should be. The most extreme type has total autonomy. That is the ability to learn and adapt in response to changing circumstances in the environment in which they are deployed, as well as being fully capable of making firing decisions on their own. For those of you familiar with the movie series, this is right out of Terminator. But there are experts in the field who believe total decision-making power is not required to be labeled autonomous. A weapon system capable of sensing, processing, and ultimately selecting a target, but with a final okay from a human being, can also be considered autonomous. Without getting too technical here, the issue is how independent should offensive weapons of war be? How much artificial intelligence should be allowed to select targets and either recommend or independently launch weapon systems? Well, it is easy for you and I to sit back and say, well, never. This is really dangerous. The problem is that these weapons are close to reality already. A number of high-profile scientists, industrialists, and intellectuals, including the late Stephen Hawking, Elon Musk, Steve Wozniak, and Noam Chomsky, among others, have sounded the alarm about going too far in utilizing artificial intelligence and offensive weapon systems. Human Rights Watch and the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots have for some time been proponents of a preemptive ban on lethal autonomous weapon systems. But there is a problem here. Most of the focus on autonomous weapons has been on the physical weapons like drones, robots, and the like, and glossed over existing cyber weapons, malware designed to attack crucial computer-controlled systems, potentially causing widespread havoc and well beyond combat zones. Put simply, autonomy has grown far more rapidly in cyberspace. A lot of this troubling activity happens without direct human supervision. Malicious computer programs that are by and large autonomous steal people's data, build botnets, lock people out of their systems until they pay ransom, and do most of the other work of cyber criminals. And we know there are programs capable of shutting down power grids, hospitals, and attack anything with a digital base. This, frankly, is of more immediate concern than the development of, say, killer robots. But the alarming truth is that the international community has virtually failed to make any progress in guidelines and regulations on interstate cyber warfare. And even more troubling, the potential human actors, the hackers and the cyber warriors may not even be under any government authority at all. Well, I said at the beginning, this is a huge topic, and I would not be the least bit surprised if the first question crossing your minds was, thank you for your talk, Dr. Simon, but I noticed you never mentioned whatever. And you would probably be right. For instance, I did not say anything about the use of EMP or electromagnetic pulse weapons capable of, among other things, destroying susceptible electronic equipment over a wide area. Nor did I spend any time on the development and deployment of laser weapons, the forerunners of Flash Gordon, ray gun, and Captain Kirk's phaser. But there is only so much time. But above all, I have said virtually nothing about the morality of war. Have we made any progress in fully comprehending the horrible destructiveness of this activity, of seeking more nonviolent, peaceful resolution of serious conflict issues? Is there such a thing as a just war? We call some wars just. Too often, those calls are made by those who have won the conflicts. No matter how much we perceive a war to be just, once the violence breaks out, do we not have to ask ourselves if we had any responsibility for creating the circumstances for war being initiated in the first place? Are there things we could have done to avoid it? The questions go on and on with sometimes confusing, contradictory, and indeed uncomfortable answers. But those are questions for another time. Thank you so much for your time. I hope I have shed at least a little light on the future of armed conflict. Take care and stay safe. Thank you very much.